Okay. Okay, cool. So thank you for coming. I guess I'll run through, I've got a few slides. It gets fairly in depth, so please do ask any questions that you have. I guess the genesis of this presentation was, while I was working at Google, we had a number of kind of McKinsey consultants and these type of people who kind of packaged up some of their kind of best practices around storytelling and presenting more generally. And so I kind of captured some of those and pulled those together and packaged it up for you guys today. So PowerPoint, this is not just how to do PowerPoint really good. We go a little bit more into storytelling. This is kind of overview of what we'll talk about today. So as Mabel, I guess we have a goal to make this company tech-led. People don't remember PowerPoint slides, they remember stories, right? I think the analogy that always sticks with me is, think about cavemen around the fire storytelling. This is the oldest way of transferring information in human history. So pre even writing on walls, right? Storytelling is how you passed on information between people, and it's very, very embedded in the way people's brains work. But telling stories with tech and data is quite hard. So how do you, on one hand, you're trying to make this company, tech-led, and you've got data to do that, but how do you do that through storytelling so that people actually remember it? It's not just a slide full of numbers and you're expecting people to remember that table for the rest of their lives, right? It's just not going to happen. It's not how people are wired. So what's this presentation about? It's really about structuring that story and structuring your data to effectively communicate it in a way that people remember and they'll kind of understand what the purpose is. What it's not about how to speak clearly or effectively, or how to make a really pretty slide that looks fantastic and can be framed and put on a wall. And it's not how to run like a brainstorming type presentation session where you're facilitating and getting feedback or anything like that. I got a couple of like slide tips at the end, but generally it's really not about that. Cool. So what makes a great presentation? So there's a very dense slide deck that I'm presenting today. So I'll share it all with you afterwards. So don't panic or like write down notes or anything like that. I think there's a lot of stuff that even I go back to regularly to just reflect on and make sure I'm kind of doing all the right things. So the first part, understand what the real problem is. Profit is going down versus our prices are not competitive. Like, what's the root cause? What's the real problem? Don't talk to outcomes without any breakdown to them. You've got to really kind of get to the nub of the real problem. Sometimes it's easy to present on something and everyone's like, that's great, that's an interesting outcome, but what? Like, what's actually happening here? And breaking down those mechanics, I think, is really important and makes it really engaging. You need clarity of thinking. You've got to structure things a little bit wider, and I go through how to structure things quite a lot. Sometimes, and I know this is particularly true at Mabel, sometimes even just demonstrating the ability to have an analytical mind, so breaking down problems into assumptions and data and a hypothesis, like, it is a demonstration enough. In some sense, it gives people confidence. Even if your answer is not right, the fact that you've taken a really rigorous approach will comfort people, aka Tony, or these type of people, more logical based people, to give you another crack at it, or to say, okay, like, going in the right direction, here's some areas you can fine tune. I trust your logic and your process and that you'll actually get to the right answer. Focusing on the audience is really important. So, as per my example, understanding it's Tony versus Peter you're presenting to, or Rachel, or anyone else in the business. A risk and compliance person obviously has a very different presentation style to someone who's in, a creative role. the types of presentation you're going to do would vary quite differently. And so it's important to really understand your audience and make the presentation focus on them. Forward thinking. So the best presentation, I guess, is one where someone asks a question and you say, next slide, and then it kind of breaks it out, right? That shows that you've anticipated, the storyline and you've structured it in a way that it flows nicely through. And then openness. So I think you've got to be careful not to really shut down and funnel people into a particular view. I think you've got to genuinely present kind of an open problem and then kind of talk through your logic. I think if you just shut down, you've got a lot of channels shut down and crossed off and you aggressively channel people, then they're resenter, right? They're not there to be told what to do. They're there because you're looking for their opinion and you're looking to kind of bring that out through the presentation. Cool. There's a couple of different types of presentation. I think this is very high level, but it's important that they're a little bit different. So diagnosis, this is where there's a problem to be solved and you want to present a recommendation to it, right? So you're trying to convince people of a particular solution and have them test kind of why your hypothesis has been kind of proven. There's project update presentations. I think this is a classic one where it's like, okay, let's take Face Off as an example, right? We're rolling out a project over 3 months. There are potential roadblocks, risks. You want to flag them with stakeholders and stuff so they're aware. But people often forget the asks part at the end. They kind of get to the end of the presentation and stakeholders like, well, you told me all the things that could go wrong with this presentation. Like, what are you actually asking? Like, why are you showing me this? Is it just to cover your ass, or are you actually, like, is there some value I can add here in terms of unblocking you or extra resources or more time, or like what specifically is the ask? And really crystallize that at the end. And then workshop presentations. So I think this is more your brainstorming workshop type conversation and the synthesis after that. So how do you kind of nicely present all the different perspectives and positions and come back? I guess I'm mostly going to focus on kind of the first two today because I guess we tend to do that stuff a little bit more. But happy to talk to others as well. So what makes a good story? Remember my low-res volcano image. Basically, a story always follows the same pattern. People are very, very predictable and want consistency in terms of how their stories play out. And so this is the critical skeleton of a good story. So to start with, you have narrative hooks. So this is a bit of a background, building empathy with kind of the characters or the problem. Rising action, something starts to happen. You get a sense something's going wrong or something's going right. There's a tension emerging. Climax, the thing actually happens, right? The volcano explodes. And then falling action, like you're kind of running away from the volcano. You're kind of getting to safety, whatever. And then conclusion, do they make it or not? Do they get to safety? Do they perish in Pompeii? Like what happens, right? So you gotta have a conclusion. And if you watch enough, CSI or these type of shows, you'll see that really it's a photocopy narrative, right? They all follow a very similar pattern, probably down to the timestamp level in terms of how the story plays out. And so effectively, this is what you want to recreate in all of your presentations and be very conscious of, right? I think sometimes people try and like go up really fast and they go down and there's a dead spot in the presentation and they try and go up again to another question and you're not really sure if the first one's been answered. Like, I think just being really clear on this narrative is really important. I should warn you as well, by the way, there are a lot of Leonardo DiCaprio memes in this presentation. I don't know why. It just kind of happened. So first one, let's do a classic story, right? I think this is the second highest grossing movie of all time still, something very, very high, certainly top 5. Classic story, you'll remember because you cried, and I know you all cried. So how did that storyline play out? Well, it's a very familiar storyline. the background narrative hooks. Leonardo, the poor guy sleeping at the bottom of the ship, met Rose, the rich girl. I think she tried to throw herself off the ship. He saved her. They fell in love. There's a bit of background there, right? So it's building emotional connection with the characters, with the problem, and you can relate to them. Obviously, the Titanic hits the iceberg. That's the event that kind of triggers it. Sorry, Hardy, for ruining it. And that's the event. That's the problem that happened, right? You put that out front. That's not the climax, right? That's not the climax is actually where most of the action happens, and this is where they're stuck on the lower decks. The water's flooding in. You remember it flowing down the stairs, and they're trapped, and people are shooting at them, and they're trying to get out, right? So the question is, like, how will they escape? And then decision, right? They find a way out. They decide to abandon ship. They decide who gets the life jacket, what they're going to hold on to, and the rich girl gets it. And then they still wrap up the story at the end, right? So they come back. Did she survive? Did she leave a good life? Did she keep the jewelry? And was it all worth it? So, you kind of remember these points, and I think each of them is critical. Like, if he had have just drowned in the middle of the ocean, I think that would have been a really bad way to end, right? You need the conclusion at the end to see, was his sacrifice worth it? Did she remember him? All these emotional things, right? So I think this is just an articulation of a standard storyline, and I really would go to the effort of thinking through each of these steps in your presentation, even if it's only, background kind of problem, going through the options and challenges, and then proposing some recommendations, and then coming through to a conclusion, which maybe is the ask or the actual outcome that you're looking for the presentation. So what makes a good story? In summary, I guess these elements all have to be there as well. So keep it simple, emotional but truthful, and I think the emotional part is really important. I think personally, I always underestimated the value of the emotional part. Just present a super logical storyline, but I think it's interesting it's much more impactful if you bring an emotional element to it, even if it's just fun or entertainment, like memes. The reason we put memes in is because they're entertaining, people can relate to them really quickly, and so, you get some type of emotional buy-in to the story. That's a very basic way of doing it, but I think that's the purpose, right? And then real but valid, like, they're real life stories. So Titanic, obviously based on a real story. Volcano, people relate to it because volcanoes are real. They understand the concept of volcano. It's a very simple metaphor. I think just making sure these narratives are in there is really important. Cool. So now we get into the actual build. So now you're all motivated, you're all stirred up by the Titanic story. Let's get into the technical stuff around how you actually do this from a more structural perspective. So essentially, there are two main stages to it. So it's really thinking through the hypothesis and the information and what conclusions you kind of want. And then it's really structuring the story of it. How do I, now that I've understood the problem I want to solve and what I want to get out of this, how do I go through and structure a story, based on the model that we just talked about? So one of the main questions, and I think this is really important, is, and it relates to know your audience, do you give the conclusions first or at the end? Is a really key choice. Maybe it seems really dumb, but it's a pretty important one. So, and this is inductive versus deductive, if you've heard those expressions before. So as an example, generally the principle is it depends on the attention span of the person you're presenting to. So it's talking to the audience. And so the first example is answers first, right? You've got an executive or a stakeholder with you know, a short attention span. You want to get the answer out pretty quickly. Maybe it's a little bit provocative. And then you kind of go through and you break down your reasoning and your criteria. So you say, we're losing customers to the competitor, right? There's a fire burning. You know, this is why you need to pay attention to this story. And then you go through the breakdown of why that's happening, and then you come to the mechanics of it, which is the root cause is our lower cost position. Like, do we want to do something about that, right? So that's the inductive way. The deductive way is obviously the opposite. So talking about price and the mechanics of the market, how important is this, building it up and talking about here's how the market lays out. And then at the end you say, okay, like because of all these structure, you know, we're losing people. And so this part, I guess, is better if the audience needs a little bit education. They need to be taken on the journey a little bit more in terms of maybe they need to understand the landscape a little better, and they need to kind of have it structured out for them so they can kind of follow you a bit more easily. So they're the kind of two approaches that you can take, and again, based on your audience. Cool. I talked through some of this stuff. I think, yeah, and I think the other part that's really important with inductive is it's best when the audience is likely going to agree on your conclusions. So, so as an example, I'll throw Tony under the bus again. If you say something like, we're losing customers, he generally agrees with more dramatic negative conclusions, right? And so throwing that out there in front of him, I think would be quite good. Someone like Peter is a little bit different. Like, I think he would like to understand like the narrative and the story, and you kind of take him along that journey, and then you kind of come to the conclusion at the end, and he's like, and he kind of, he likes that storytelling approach a little bit better. So you've got his step-by-step buy-in along the way, and he feels like he's moving the story along as you go, right? He feels more ownership of the story and the conclusion at the end. And I think that difference is really important, and you know, we have two very different founders, so I think it's a good illustration in terms of how they work. Again, don't stress about the detail of this because I'll share the slide with you later. I know it's kind of dense. So the next slide is the most consultanty of the presentation, which is the Minto pyramid principle, which is like the backbone of how McKinsey makes their money. But essentially, what it is structuring an argument in a very methodical way, right? So I think as an engineer, I certainly appreciate this structure. And they've even added little slide numbers for you, so you can think about, you know, if I really want to be super structured, this is how I would structure my presentation. So this is the answer first, more of the inductive example, right? So the first slide has kind of your intro, and it kind of summarizes and moves pretty quickly to an answer, and then it steps through the logic, right? So this would be a very good Tony presentation, giving the answer quickly first and the problem, and then you say, okay, here's why I know my shit, and I've got first argument, which is, they call it MECE from the other argument. So there's no overlap between the two arguments, right? You're not arguing two different angles of the same data point or problem, whatever. You're keeping them quite separate. And then they're supported by underneath by data and requirements and reasons, for example. So I think it's important as well to note that on the right there, you see like, it should actually be standalone as an argument. So if you say something about, let me think, pricing or something, then really like that argument should stand alone with the data underneath it. So you say pricing is too low, and then you have all the arguments for pricing underneath that. And then the other argument is our product is not good enough, and then you have all the arguments that the product's not good enough. And you can say each of those stands alone as its own little argument, fully supported by data, and there's no kind of duplication or overlap. I think sometimes you end up just like resurfacing the same data point for like 3 different arguments, and it gets confusing, right? People are like, well, which one are you trying to argue? Which one's the strongest? Like, why do I keep hearing this? Like, is your whole case built on one data point and then it's probably a little bit weak? You haven't really kind of thought it through too widely. So that's important. The other part here, and just in terms of granularity, is you don't want, like, there's always different strengths of arguments, but you don't want different granularity of arguments. So for example, pricing example again, one of your arguments could be, relative to all other home care providers, we are the cheapest provider, or the cheapest service. But then the next argument is something like our mobile app has the best color on the click to buy button. It's like, why? How did we just jump from like a strategic argument down to a super tactical argument? Like, it makes no sense, right? You're confusing the audience in terms of what level you're pitching at. Are you meant to be comparing it? Like, are these arguments even on the same level, right? So they may both be true. They may both be part of the problem or part of the answer, but you've kind of, the granularity is way off and it gets confusing. Cool. So now we've structured a bit of we understand how to structure a storyline. We understand how to logically turn it into kind of data points and arguments. It's inception. We need to go deeper. So so let's go into the actual communication part, right? How do we pull that all together? We've got our story. We've got the actual arguments and data points we want to have. Now we need to think about, like, how are we actually going to say it? How is it all going to come together? So the biggest mistake that people make at this point is starting slides and let's just write the slides and see what falls out. A much better way of doing it, and I know like people think it takes more time, but really it doesn't, because you end up reworking your slides 50 times. Like, this is a much better way to think through, is to take that pyramid first of all and turn it into a storyline. Then you do a really rough, what they call storyboard, but basically it's like thinking about each of the steps of your story and how you want to tell them. So this is what my narrative is going to have. It's just going to be background. It's going to capture a persona or whatever. This is what my climax is going to have. This is what, and you just think through a really rough level, and then you actually start writing the slides at the end. I didn't know that fun fact about Leonardo DiCaprio as well. His mother chose him an unusual name because the unborn child kicked when she viewed a picture of Leonardo da Vinci. Who knew? I don't know if that's real, but I found that as a really bad slide design. Okay, so first part, storyline. So really, it's purely just bullet point version of that pyramid that we laid out. So I think, and it should read, right? It should really, you should be able to go through it and you see how it kind of sequentially builds as you go through. And I find like a lot of email writing these days is in a very similar kind of vein. Like, just you say, okay, someone says, what's your opinion on this? And you come back with a series of bullet points, which are like, here's what we want to achieve. Here's what I think the opportunities are. Here are my recommendations. If you're okay with that, let's go ahead and do this, right? Like, I think a lot of even email communication is following a similar format these days, which is very logical and connects with people's, people can relate really easily. So then what should a good storyline kind of have? Again, understand your audience, be really, really clear on the key takeaways. And I think the next slide is probably one for answer all the questions, inductive, deductive. We talked through all this, but this is just a checklist for you. I think the other reasons why a storyline is useful that get underappreciated, to split up the work. So if you sit down and you quickly have a quick meeting when your squad gets a problem or has to come back with an exec update or has to, answer why you're so slow on something, is to come back and lay out the storyline, and then you say, okay, how are we going to divide this work up? And the storyline's really useful for that. You've got your 10 bullet points of how your story is going to lay out, and you say, okay, Jimmy, you're taking this one, Samira, you're taking this one, like blah, blah, blah. Like you go through and you say, okay, like we're cool. Next part, which the data team will be thankful for, and hopefully you as data champions will empathize with, is it helps you understand the data sources up front. So you don't get to the end and then you're like, fuck, like there's a serious gap in this storyline. I need a slide just to fill this gap because I've realized my lifetime values make no sense if I don't explain why our lifetime is so long of our users, right? And then you got to pull another data point around average lifetime of users, and you never expected that, and the data team didn't have it, and it becomes this last minute scramble, right? This is a key reason for last minute scrambles. And then the last one is actually if you test it with the person you're presenting to, it can be quite powerful as well, and it just checks alignment up front. So sometimes what's really effective is actually avoiding the presentation altogether. And if you can do the previous slide of bullet pointing a storyline and some really high level conclusions and send it to the person you're going to present to, they might say, that's enough, great, like mission accomplished. They might say, this is totally not what I was asking for. Actually, what I meant by experience was something totally different. Or they'll check you on some stuff. They'll say, I think you're missing some data or some points or whatever. Either way, you're testing alignment between the person that you're presenting to, which is really like the purpose and what your understanding of the kind of problem is. So it's really, really important to do that. And again, a reason for not jumping straight to slides and wasting a whole bunch of time. And then a storyboard. So this is really like, this sounds fancier than it is. This is really like, okay, like what's the one thing I need to have on each slide for this to make sense? Even if you do it to this level of, okay, I need to have a title, I need to have a bit of an agenda, get my objectives out there. It's a market share presentation, so I need to talk about the market, then I need to show my trend of the market, and then I need to have a conclusion. Like, it helps you understand, again, like the key data points you'll need to have on there. Do they make sense in a story context? Am I missing some structure? Do I need to add an agenda or a roadmap or a sequence of points or something like this to just structure the whole thing a bit better? And yeah, final point on this one is obviously like, don't start writing slides until you know what you're trying to say and why you're trying to say it. I think sometimes I do this regularly, like I kind of start doing this and then I realize like I've overcomplicated things, or I'm just frustrated and I'm building this because I got the shits and I don't actually want anything out of it, or or I need to finish something before I can prove anything to someone, or I need to, there's a quick experiment I could do to fill a gap in my storyline. Like, I think there are lots of good reasons for doing this part of it. In some sense, you can argue like the worst case scenario is actually building the deck at the end. I think ideally it's kind of better to have this narrative in your mind and almost be testing it out a little bit beforehand, whether it's in the bullet points in an email or even just in a conversation. I think when you get really good at storytelling, you can actually do some of this stuff almost in a casual conversation with a stakeholder, and you can test your storyline a couple of times before it becomes serious enough to have to package it up and communicate it more widely. Cool. And then this is a good one again, like particularly for engineers or subject matter experts. Your biggest obstacle is that you know too much. So the chances of you confusing the argument, distracting the other person, taking too long, missing the point, putting too much content in there, like that's the biggest challenge, really. It's very much a case of how do you simplify your story to really be as clean and as true to that volcano storyline narrative as possible. Like Titanic, I can reduce to 5 pitches, right? And I don't know how many words that was, less than 50 words. And you all understand the entire movie, right? Like it's not a complicated story. The best stories are not at all complicated. And this made how many $1 billion, right? So I think just the art is really getting a super simple story that people will genuinely remember and take away. And I think sometimes there's a bit of a defensive attitude that, well, I told them everything they'd want to know and they still don't believe me, so what else could I do, right? Like, it's not about more, right? It's not about bombarding them with documentation and volume, and you just hope that you'll eventually wear them down with content, right? That's not how people get persuaded, unless they just get really tired and give up. That's your strategy, but that's generally not a good strategy. It's keeping it super simple and just being really clear what you want out of it. So even to the point of like saying each idea once, like if you keep repeating the same thing through, like they'll get bored and they'll get confused and like, where are we back to in the storyline? Like, I've kind of forgotten. And yeah, even just including slides that look pretty, and you're like, well, I worked super hard on this graph and it looks super amazing, but it doesn't really fit in the storyline, but I just want to prove that, like, you know, I didn't do all that work for nothing, so I'm going to put it in. Don't do it. Like, I know it hurts, I feel the pain, but I just don't do it, because then they'll be like, where is this storyline going now? And then you're like, no, come back to the main storyline, but they're already confused by your amazing graph and how it ties in, and they can't reconcile it. Just leave it out. And you can show it to your friends and get credit from them. Cool. So again, simple, self-sufficient. Like, people should be able to pick up the presentation or the story and not need any more information, right? So again, Titanic, it doesn't require a whole lot of background in shipbuilding or the mechanics of hull construction to understand that storyline, right? It's not really that relevant, unless you decide to nerd out on it later, and you can do that. But it's genuinely like you hit an iceberg and you sink, right? Like, it's not, that's all you need to know. Concise, yeah, again, what's necessary. Keep it super tight to the story. Don't go off on a tangent. You know, they didn't go on Titanic, they didn't go off into another engineer trying to fix the hull and how his struggles, and then when they came back to the main story, let's catch up with where Rose is at. Like, you don't do deviations, you know, even if it's quite interesting of the whole design, it's not relevant to the story, right? Save that for another presentation. In terms of format, like, it's pretty straightforward. This is my only real like slide writing presentation piece. I think sometimes it's nice to have a little key in the top left. So this is in step 1, step 2, step 3. I kind of did this, I don't know if you noticed, but on some of the previous slides, you know, I have a little icon up here. This is step 3, which is under slide writing, right? I think it just helps people remember when I'm changing sections, if it's kind of a subsection. Key message or kicker is the really critical part. I mean, some people, the purest, most simple way of doing a slide deck is just with headlines, right? And it's just, this is the takeaway. You should really be able to read the headlines of a deck and understand exactly the storyline without reading any of the content in the slide, right? That's the goal here. And obviously it should support. So the headline should make a statement, answer the question, and then the content of the slide is just to support that headline and nothing else, right? So don't have a disconnect between the two. You know, you say, this is, you know, so a lifetime value doubles over time, and then underneath it you have a chart which shows, you know, something else related to the price we charge, or something like this, like our fee structure. It's like, I get it's tangentially relevant, but it doesn't directly support the headline. Equally, like a really simple mistake, some people do this, they say our lifetime value doubles over time, and then the chart goes down, right? You're like, okay, well, you're showing, you know, the opposite graph of what you should be showing. You're showing churn over time, which, yes, that's why it's doubling, but it's not. Again, people have to, they get mentally confused as to why it's not visually showing a line doubling. Font size 14, I think, just generally, like, if you really are putting a lot of text on there, it's just a super bad idea. I think one thing that's really, it helps you simplify is putting a link down the bottom to the dashboard. I think, and Mabel is a little bit guilty of this sometimes. I think we put in charts and that kind of stuff, and people say, where did you get this chart? Or this could be interesting for another analysis I did. Can you send it to me later, or this kind of stuff? And I think just having the link there, just helps kind of shortcut that process. And don't be afraid to leave blank space, right? I think a good slide really has a lot of white space. And talking to the designers among you, I think that's certainly true. Again, it just helps people focus and keeps it simple. And then my most basic slide. So I think use frameworks. I talk a lot about structure and logic. I think, again, frameworks are checklists, roadmaps, charts, tables, these kind of things. I think you should use them where appropriate throughout. Particularly when you're trying to illustrate breaking down a problem, then I think visual structures to break that problem down help a lot. Use arrows, like, again, simplification. How do you instruct the reader on how to read the slide? How do you make it super obvious, the flow within the slide? And then use colors. So again, like, people are visual, bolding, italics, big fonts for the real key insights, colors. I've seen people use, like, and we do this in our product, really positive colors, really positive metrics are in red, and you're like, why? That makes no sense. I'm taking away a different kind of connotation. Be conscious about that, right? People will even look at a slide like this and they'll say, oh, frameworks is the best one to do because you put it first and it's in green. Like you've got to be aware of some of that kind of stuff, and you can kind of implicitly sway people just on really basic stuff like that. Cool. So that's basically it. I have one last inspirational quote for you. The only thing standing between you and your goal is the bullshit story you keep telling yourself as to why you can't achieve it. I think this is some, blunt motivation that I think, in a meta sense, it's that storytelling is important. If you don't structure your story really well for other people, then you end up spending your time structuring a story to yourself about why you failed. And I think that's a waste of good storytelling time. I think you should really put it into the positive message, and you can actually get very good at making change. So take pride in that and put the effort into it. And I think it's a much better use of energy. So that was kind of my storytelling for you. I will stop recording and then